Charlie, if we look at all the major issues in today's world, be they social or be they science and religion or all kinds of things, if you dig down deep enough, consciousness and what is consciousness is at the root of a great many of our issues. So I'm going to focus on that. And the way I want to start is by seeing what are the avenues that we can get at consciousness. And I want to list four and see how you can define them. We have psychology, we have neuroscience, we have what you've been involved in with transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. So give me your sense of those four on how they help us understand consciousness.
I'm for all of them and probably more that I don't even know about yet. I mean, of course, the neuroscience approach is very useful. Even if you're a dualist like I am in a practical sense and think of the mind as driving the car of the body, the more we know about the car, the more we know about how it can be driven and for better or worse and so forth. So the more we know about the brain functioning, great. The psychological approach, of course, is very important. We have models of how to run the world that are based on people being completely rational, for instance. But even knowing a little psychology, people aren't completely rational. And so we have to begin to take that into account. As to the transpersonal, which I think is really important, transpersonal is a fancy word for spiritual. Okay, I'll tell you, it's because spiritual is such a loaded word, okay? Back in 1975, for instance, I had a book coming out called Spiritual Psychologies, in which I had asked people in 8 different spiritual traditions to write about that spiritual path as a psychology rather than as a spiritual thing to make it more accessible in the modern world. Well, the book was about to go in press, and I got a call from my editor saying, good news and bad news. The good news is that the major psychology book club wants to have it as its monthly selection. All right. The bad news is that this is a psychology book club. Psychologists cannot handle the word spiritual. We have to name it something else. So I said, okay, we'll call it transpersonal psychology because hardly anybody knew what that meant. But it's trans in the sense of transcending. It's about a psychology that says that some sort of spiritual experience is an essential part of being human. And instead of just kind of shoving it off into the religion corner, let's study it. Let's see what kind of experiences people have, what they do with those, how they use them in a healthy way or a non-healthy way. To me, transpersonal psychology then is an attempt to bring science and spirituality together in a constructive way. That psychology can ask questions, for instance, about what kind of spiritual growth techniques are actually effective for what kind of person. Instead of, this is the ancient technique used by the yogis of old, you must do it exactly this way. We can find out what really works and how that actually works.
Fourth category, parapsychology.
Parapsychology is particularly important because the modern view of mainstream materialistic science is that the mind is nothing but the brain. It's all confined in here. And so spiritual ideas or religious ideas about God or gods, prayer, things like that, they're all nonsense. Now, the trouble is that human beings continue to have spiritual experiences, and when you tell them those experiences are nonsense, you make people sick. You make people, you invalidate part of people's own soul. Well, of course, if it is all nonsense, maybe you're doing them a service, even if it's difficult. But if there's something real to what underlies spirituality, we need to know that. And that's where parapsychology is very important. We're using the best kind of experimental scientific methods. I think we've shown that several different types of psychic abilities, ESP, actually exist. And so they don't say, that the Baptists know more than the Buddhists or something like that, but they say there's something real about the spiritual nature of human beings. Don't just throw it out. Try to study it and refine our knowledge.
Or we could say non-physical in the parapsychological world, because that may be a more neutral term than spiritual.
If you want to be very conservative, yes, you can say that given what we know about, say, extrasensory perception at this point, it's non-physical. Okay, it's not, for instance, telepathy, for instance, is not some kind of mental radio, because we know how radio works. You've got to generate some electromagnetic waves, they have to be transmitted.
It's too weak, it doesn't fall off with distance.
Shielding doesn't affect it,
right.
so we know it's not like that kind of thing.
So of these four categories, I think it would be fair to say psychology and neuroscience, your mainstream, everybody would agree with that. The last two categories, transpersonal or spiritual psychology, to kind of let it out of the closet, and parapsychology, the existence of non-physical things, set your view apart from perhaps mainstream science, although there's a large number of people who subscribe to that. So you would have all four be windows on this concept of consciousness.
Right. My whole approach to life has always been to look at everything that's relevant to a situation instead of coming up with my favorite theory and say, this is it, and don't bother me with anything else.
One of the favorite things that you like to say is you don't want to be a fool and believe something that is just patently wrong.
That's right. I hate to be fooled. It's embarrassing. And I know something like parapsychology is very controversial among some mainstream scientists, actually, usually the older ones who are more identified with current theories and the like. But my finding has been that the more opposed mainstream scientists are to parapsychology, the less they actually know about what the data actually is, the quality of it, and so forth. So we're dealing with prejudice among human beings.
Let's look at consciousness now from a systems point of view. You've written about that, and how can we use systems analysis to understand consciousness?
You know, before I became a psychologist, I was a radio engineer, and I was used to dealing with complex machinery, electronic stuff, where different parts worked together and something came out of that whole thing. And as I became a psychologist, I saw the same thing could apply to different aspects of the mind or the brain. It wasn't that you just had one little thing here, they all interacted together. So when I became interested in altered states of consciousness, for instance, I didn't get overly specialized in some one thing like hypnosis, but I looked at the whole spectrum and came up with a systems approach for seeing how the mind could kind of rearrange its components into a different shape and do something different. An analogy I like to use, for instance, is an airplane and a tractor. They both have some similar parts. They both have engines, but you put them together and add a few parts to one and take some from the other, and airplanes and tractors do very different things. You know, if you want to plow the field, an airplane won't do you much good at all. If you want to get somewhere in a hurry, a tractor won't do you much good at all. It's the same thing with the mind and various altered states of consciousness. You put the mind together in a certain way, you can do certain things very well. You put it together in a different way, you don't do those same things, but you can do something else well.
Under a systems approach, what are some subsystems that you would have as your building blocks, so to speak?
The subsystems I've thought about for consciousness are really, I think, terribly obvious ones. Memory, reasoning, our sense of identity. That's a particularly important one in terms of its practical effects. You know, it's like we add the I quality to something.
Look, I think it's important, even if it's obvious, to articulate differences, because in some people's mind, they may all flow together and we just have this one amorphous concept. But to regularly look at the different pieces is helpful. We have memory, we have the sense of I. What are some others?
The space-time sense is another important subsystem of consciousness. We tend to think that space and time are just out there and we perceive them, but actually the mind generates space and time. You could see this in dreams. I've never had a person tell me a dream in which they said, well, first there was a Volkswagen, and then there was a banana, and then there was some sand on the seashore. Things come together in a story. They're organized in space and time. In a dream, that organization is very arbitrary because it's not limited to what's happening outside of us. In the waking state, that same subsystem is still generating space and time, but now it's got all this sensory input that it has to synchronize itself with. You know, I have to keep track of the fact that you're there and not build up an internal representation that puts you in a different place, or I'm going to get in trouble.
So here you see a subsystem, sense of space and time, operating in a different way based on certain constraints.
And in other altered states of consciousness, it may operate in a different kind of ways. In certain drug-induced states, for instance, time will be constructed so that it seems to flow much more slowly. or much more rapidly, and say in certain excited kinds of states and the like.
How about the sense of causality? We know what causality is in the physical world. Is it similar in the psychological, mind, consciousness world?
I think the idea of causality actually came from psychological experience to begin with and was only later applied to the physical world. I want my hand to raise up and it raises up. Causality. I mean, it's a direct experience of wanting something to happen and your body doing it, or your mind doing it, say if I want to create a certain mental image or something like that. Then we projected the idea of causality onto the physical world, and we got more and more precise about it. And lo and behold, we have physics and chemistry and all those wonderful sciences. So it works very well, but it's very much a psychological concept to begin with.
So then how do we kind of integrate this all together and begin to assess the deep meaning of consciousness? Because you've looked at consciousness and have called yourself an emergent dualist. And how does that integrate with this whole systems approach?
When you talk about assessing consciousness as if we're ready for some kind of final assessment, I don't really go along with that. I think there's so much about consciousness we don't understand yet. Even ordinary consciousness, which we assume we understand very well, if you start looking at it in detail, there's lots of things we don't understand very well at all. So even though I've come up with a systems approach to try to talk about the ways different aspects of consciousness work together and how you stabilize it with feedback so you stay in the same state and whatnot, to me, there's so much more to be basically learned. Okay, I mean, sure, if we come up with these concepts along the way, that's fine, but we mustn't get stuck with them. Theories are tools to help us keep looking. Whenever we get too enamored with the theory, oh, I understand, then we're liable to get stuck and not make any more progress.